Dr. Wendy Knepper is a senior lecturer in the Department of English at Brunel University. She is the author of Patrick Chamoiseau, A Critical Introduction, and the extremely useful and smart York Notes, Companions of Post-Colonial Literatures, as well as very many articles and papers. And at present she's working on a book-length project about world literary mappings of terror and cataclysmic events in contemporary Caribbean writing.
So today I'm going to talk about Noel Hopkinson's The New Moon's Arms and Thomas Glave's essay on Whose Caribbean, an Allegory in Part. And the title of my paper is Queer Ecologies and Planetary Erotics, and the work of Thomas Glave and Noel Hopkinson. Sexual citizenship has become a mainstay of gender theory and queer studies, especially following the publication of David Trevor Evans' Sexual Citizenship and David Bell and John Binney's The Sexual Citizen, Queer Politics and Beyond. Likewise, the queering of Caribbean identity has provided the basis, at least in fiction and scholarship, for positioning a reconstructed body politic. For example, narratives such as Reynaldo Arenas' Before Night Falls, Patricia Powell's The Pagoda, and Shani Mutu's Serious Blues at Night represent the queer Caribbean body as a necessary challenge to heteronormative notions of citizenship, especially in the context of transnational and global migrations. More recently, in a Caribbean context, both the exploitative dynamics of globalization and the possibilities for agency and transformed notions of citizenship have been discussed in texts such as Kamala Kampadou's Sexing the Caribbean, Gender, Race, and Sexual Labor, a collection of essays called Sex and the Citizen, Interrogating the Caribbean, edited by Faith Smith, Mimi Scheller's new book, Citizenship from Below, Erotic Agency and Caribbean Freedom, and here's a bit of a promo, a forthcoming essay collection, The Cross-Dressed Caribbean, by Benedict and Maria Cristina Fumagalli. So today, in response to such work, I want to explore the interplay between eros and citizenship in a globalizing world, as represented by Glave and Hopkinson. Drawing on Audre Lorde's distinction between the pornographic and the erotic, as Kate Bolden did, I will outline how both Glave and Hopkinson reconstruct the body politic and notions of Caribbean and world citizenship through what I'm calling erotic ecologies and queer planetary bodies, and this will become clear, I hope, as I go through the reading. But specifically, I want to examine how both Hopkinson and Glave represent the vulnerable child, and how that child is being represented through both erotic and planetary discourses. In her essay on the uses of the erotic as power, Lorde refers to the pornographic as emphasizing mere sensation without feeling. And I quote here in a longer passage. When we look away from the importance of the erotic in the development and sustenance of our power, or when we look away from ourselves as we satisfy our erotic needs in concert with others, we use each other as objects of satisfaction, rather than sharing our joy and satisfying, rather than make connections with our similarities and differences. By contrast, she observes that the erotic embodies love in all its aspects, born of chaos, and personifying creative power and harmony. While the erotic is specifically associated with women's relations to themselves and others, Lorde notes that it has the power to make our lives and the lives of our children richer and more possible. And it's this particular relationship that I'm interested in. The erotic defines the notion of instrumentality, the pornographic, or any system which defines the good in terms of profit rather than in terms of human need. In Lorde's view, the erotic requires a sense of connection to one's inner self as well as the other. Above all, it requires mutual consent. As such, it serves as a form of political power in the face of a racist, patriarchal, and anti-erotic world. Likewise, this distinction between a pornographic economy and an erotic ecology informs Thomas Glave's representation of the transgender child, in Whose Caribbean, an Allegory in Part. Initially, the child is presented in magical, realistic terms as an entity or a body who defines gender binarism and heteronormativity. I'm just going to quote a longer passage here. And so it came to pass that upon that time, not so long ago, in that part of the world where there lived a child who dreamt. I'm not so sure even now as to the definitive facial features of that child, but I am fairly certain that the child was both female and male, a common enough occurrence in that place of the child's origin at that time, as contrary to numerous prevailing opinions happens frequently today. The child, let us know him, her as she, he, possessed a slender penis of startlingly delicate green, the truest color of the sea that he had always loved, that sea which licked and foamed out and back, out and in again, all about the shores of that place, as he also possessed a vagina and a uterus, which, as was common knowledge among those who knew him, her, produced at least twice or 3 times per year, without assistance from anyone, a race of brazen dolphins. The child's transgender cross-species body subverts fixed categories of knowledge and species thinking, embodying many of the attributes that characterize Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's definition of the queer as that open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances and resonances, lapses and excesses of meaning when the constituent elements of anyone's gender, of anyone's sexuality aren't made or can't be made to signify monolithically. We might argue that the text unfolds in a queer space and time through the use of phrases such as, so it came to pass upon that time, not so long ago in that part of the world, suggesting that the chronology and synecdoche are not really that easy to establish, linking the narrative to the world, but also confounding easily known or identifiable relations to time and place. At the first glance, this use of magical realism may seem to invoke something of an ecological erotic, characterized by fabulous forms of planetary reproduction, linking the human and non-human worlds in seamless unity. This queer environmentalism seems to invoke the planetary, in a kind of Spivakian sense, that reimagines relations to the world that elude neoliberal economic globalization. At the same time, the text takes an environmental turn, such as the kind described by Lawrence Boel, when he describes the environmental text as one that shows how the non-human environment seems to subsume the human within its sphere. The child is presented as a dreamer, caught up in an erotic ecological relationship. He dreamt of tamarinds, of course, and of star apples and green mangoes that eventually rendered senseless by the day's stunning heat, plunged from their trees to ooze their fragrant juices along the largely still unexplored inner paths of his thighs. But of course, this Edenic imagery cannot be separated from the pornotropical, to borrow a phrase from Anne McClintock, in its representation of the tropical fruits and the child, both of whom ooze juices and are embodied as objects to be consumed. Here, too, we are not far from the colonial discourse of sex tourism, such as described by Mimi Scheller when she observes that the erotic presentation of the Caribbean child in promotional materials for tourism links child prostitution to Edenic images of the Caribbean. She says, quote, the sexualization of young exotic bodies, male and female, has become a standard tool of Caribbean tourist promotion, from hotel brochures to magazine advertising and guidebooks, unquote. In this instance, magical realism seems to fuse ecological perspectives with the pornotropical tendencies of imperialism, colonial nostalgia, and the lure of an exotic queer paradise. However, Glave complicates this reading of the fantastical child, and I would suggest he sets it up in the way that Todorov means when he says that the fantastic is undecidable, as something that could be potentially open to a kind of planetary resistant reading at the same time that's offering a kind of pornotropic embodiment. So he I think, holds in suspension these two possible interpretations, but then he offers a very sharp critique of the realities of globalization and embodiment. He presents the child as a vulnerable subject who lives in the face of numerous threats in, quote, that place which through the wills and workings of Osun and Oya, stealthy buccaneers or cruise ship companies, slave traders or airline advertisements, or a combination of any and all, became what we call today the Caribbean, unquote. Here, the uncertainties of time are no longer free-floating or queer, but firmly located within the long history of the global Caribbean, which has unfolded through the overlaps of globalization and empire. Cruise ship companies and slave traders are part of the global system of traffic, which has brought exploitation into the region, commoditizing Caribbean bodies past and present. The child is imagined also as a prostitute to be traded for, quote, a few pennies, $1 here or there, unquote, by sex tourists who seek to consume the Caribbean in order to satisfy their appetite for domination and pornographic pleasure. The dangers to the child extend from the marauders of the past to the IMF, the World Bank, the transnational corporate behemoths, the first and foremost as nexus of all three, the united, severely capitalist, fiercely indifferent to human and all life states. The child longs for safety in a homophobic nation, other options within a disjunctive global economy, the freedom to choose where to live rather than endure economic migration, uncorrupted democracy, and the pleasures associated with erotic agency. In distant proximities, dynamics beyond globalization, James Rosenow argues that globalization represents a complex phenomenon which entails economic as well as cultural, social, political, and ecological processes. Their salience, he remarks, is highlighted by focusing on the ways in which the local and global forces shape each other. For Rosenow, the globalized world can be seen as what he calls fragmigrated, a term that indicates that the world is both integrating and fragmenting or coming apart at the seams at the same time. Such an approach complements Arjun Appadurai's view that we live in a world of disjunctive, uneven worldly flows, but Rosenow's emphasis on fragmigration highlights the tensions and potential overlaps between various often competing spatial and cultural affiliations to world. And this seems to me especially useful when thinking about Glave's approach to describing the body of the child in ways that both perpetuate and dismantle pornotropical imaginaries, while also calling for new kinds of ecological imaginaries. Rosenow suggests that the globalizing world marks a departure from the past on account of, quote, the contradictions, ambiguities, complexities, uncertainties of our contemporary world, unquote. But Glave's strategies of representations highlight a long and shifting history of ambiguities and uncertainties. And here he is closer to critics like Roland Robertson and Walter Mignolo when he situates the contemporary scene of the globalized Caribbean against an environmental, spatio-historical backdrop. And here we're back to the age of conquest and discovery again, this idea to kind of think about the unevenness of time and also the specific Caribbean context for thinking about ecology and the queer. His work, too, here then resembles that of other scholars of the Caribbean, such as Sidney Mintz, Mimi Schaller, and Alandra Bronfman, who argue that the Caribbean has long been a forerunner of globalization through its participation in the global economy, mass migration, global trade, cross-cultural contact, creolization, and so forth. Moving beyond critique, Glave nonetheless discloses an erotic ecology that fulfills Audre Lorde's emphasis on mutuality and the ethics of care. Fulfills the erotic promise. In a zone of safety and love, the erotic ecology holds a sense of promise for pleasures freely chosen, given, and received. Glave observes that, quote, true democracy delights in having its belly rubbed by lively congress through which wide room for all voices is made, unquote. This eroticized public sphere demands a constant, energetic, interrogating engagement with history. Glave aims to foster a more inclusive sense of democracy by documenting the malign effects associated with the exclusion of queer peoples from full citizenship and political life in Jamaica, the United States, and Cuba. He offers a global view of the Caribbean by recounting stories about the denial of permission for gay cruise ships to dock in the Cayman Islands, the trauma of gay refugee exile, and homophobic violence. Through his critique of the communal, regional, national, and global, he highlights the global scape of sexual discrimination, which in various ways bars full citizenship. So he's offering both an integrating and a fragmenting view. This fragmigrated body of the transgender Caribbean child is envisioned walking on a country Caribbean road, holding the hand of a partner, hoping to challenge the multiscalar forces, local, national, global, which impede his or her ultimately human freedom, as Glave describes it. The question then of who's Caribbean thus calls attention to the role of the fragmigrating body politic, the ways in which sexual citizenship serves to remap a sense of being and belonging in the world. And the essay ends with a return to the dreamscape of an erotic ecological relationship to the sea, peoples from around the world walking on the waves towards the shore. Echoing Audre Lorde, Glave concludes with the celebration of the finally untethered, always respectful, ever necessary human yes. Thus, he extends Lorde's lesbian feminist conception of the power of the erotic to the sphere of a transgender and queer global politics. By highlighting the ways in which the fragmigrated Caribbean body is articulated through pornographic economics and erotic ecologies. Glaive critiques the forces of exploitation that serve to fragment and do violence to bodies as well as to the body politic. And he's thinking more widely, I think, about world citizenship. At the same time, he calls for an eroticized sense of democracy, which enables reproduction through dialogue and exchange, through mutuality. The enabling of erotic agency is, as we have seen, connected to a wider tissue of fragmentative relationships, inviting a sensuous being in the world, a relationship to others, and a sense of kinship within the environment. So in a way, he's offering a queer view of the democratic. Attentive to the role of distant proximity in time and space, Glaive highlights the need to reconstitute citizenship and perhaps even a more expansive approach to the articulation of global justice through the reclamation of these fragmented bodies of the Caribbean. And likewise, this queer, ecological, and erotic planetary approach to citizenship and community informs Nalo Hopkinson's The New Moon's Arms. This novel takes place on an imaginary island of Cuyaba, and it recounts events in the life of Calamity, whose original name was Chastity. She's renamed herself. A menopausal woman who adopts a child thrown up by the sea onto the shore. One day while on the beach, she discovers a young person who at first glance appears to be a nearly drowned boy, who is unable to speak English and seems to be disabled by webbings on his body. Although Calamity has early memories of meeting earlier such sea persons, she accepts the child as human and comes to take him in as a foster child. As he is unable to communicate his name, Calamity names him, calling him Agwe, a reference to one of the original Loa in the Voodoo pantheon, who came down in the first waves of energies that formed the planet. So here we have a kind of planetary name he's been given. Agwe is also considered to rule over the sea, fish, aquatic life, and as well serves as a patron protector of fishermen and sailors. Instinctively, Calamity recognizes that the child is non-human and perhaps dates back to an original chaos. But the name she gives him proves to be ironic, as the sea child is unable to protect himself from those who have fished him out of the sea and seems as vulnerable as the many other endangered creatures who are mentioned within the book, including the Mediterranean monk and the extinct Caribbean monk seal. The Mediterranean monk seal and the Caribbean monk seal. Despite her strong ecological awareness of biodiversity, which we see throughout the novel, Calamity gives in to the pressure to view the child's webbed hands and feet and scaly skin as signs of disability. And in fact, she herself has webbed fingers, so it's quite strange that she is so interested in viewing the body in a normative way. So she allows the child to be operated on, removing the skin between his legs, which allows him to find, as we later find out, a kind of mertail so that he can actually put his legs together and swim more effectively. So that ultimately, when this child is returned to its parents in the sea, it's effectively disabled. Calamity's desire to normalize the child despite her own past experience with non-human beings, and non-human is perhaps the wrong word, characters who defy the human-non-human divide, would be more accurate, is mirrored by an inability to come to terms with the sexual transformations within her own body and her erotic relationships with other, as well as queer identities. And it's a wider part of the critique of the novel. During her menopausal experience of hot flushes, objects and memories from her gendered, planetary, and sexual history return to the surface in ways that force her to consider again her assumptions about the world, and objects like literally magically, it seems, appear from the past. Scenes of repressed memories often surface and counter discursive sections of the narrative, which are offset in italic text and seem to reinforce their non-normative tendencies. So basically, when you're reading the text, there's the normal stream of normal font of the text, and then there are scenes that appear in italics. So we're constantly having to negotiate two different typographies, but also two different registers of meaning. And just as such scenes cannot be easily assimilated into Calamity's consciousness, she is also seen to reject queer identities and express homophobic views. But the use of such typography in these counter-discursive scenes performs part of the wider discourse of consciousness raising, intervening by calling attention to the need to reconnect erotically and also to reconnect to the past in order to transform her wider relationships to the environment and the ecologies of which she is a part. Notably, Hopkinson includes a magical realistic tale of a Dada lady on a slave ship whose active supernatural resistance to enslavement initiates the community of sea peoples to which this child belongs. And we get a kind of long broken up story of how the slave ship is moving through space, and finally the Dada lady invokes her supernatural powers, which are also tied to her reproductive potential. I can't go into all the details of it, but when she does so, all of the enslaved people on the ship are transformed into sea creatures. So we have a kind of story of origins taking place, but we also have the establishment of two interlinked communities, one seemingly the human community of enslaved peoples, and the other the non-human community of those who have escaped slavery. In linking these two communities, then, there's a forming of an association between the human and the non-human through the queering and destabilization, the erotic ecology of the sea. This queer planetary vision, which emerges through the discourses of the sea and its erotic associations, is also played out in other aspects of the narrative. There's a figure called Hector, who is a bisexual marine biologist who has ostensibly come to study these monk seals, an endangered species, and he brings the erotic and the queer and the ecological into dialogue just by being who he is. He embodies all of these. And Calamity meets Hector when she discovers Agwe on the beach. Seeing Hector in his wetsuit, Calamity is immediately attracted to him and indulges in erotic fantasies, which significantly are mediated by images of sex tourism. In his ardent defense of endangered lives and queer identities, Hector becomes a symbolic figure in the narrative, embodying a queer ecological perspective of planetary life. And this queering of the sea is also evidenced in the life of Agwe. Eventually, we learn that the sea child's name is actually, and I'm not going to pronounce it properly, so sorry, Chiabatro, a name that means destiny in Nigeria. His mother has shortened the name down to an affectionate diminutive of Chichi, linking his identity, as Hopkinson points out, to the three Chichi or queer men of a different kind in the narrative. The very name of the child thus elicits a queer, fluid, erotic otherness, linking the histories of Africa, the Black Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the New World imaginary more generally. Thus, through the presence of this planetary child, who comes from a community of sea dwellers, Hopkinson brings together her erotic and ecological discourses. As with Glaive, then, the question of consent plays a pivotal role in the narrative, the consent in this case of the child to its renaming, to the surgery, which it clearly doesn't want. But where Glaive refers to the ever necessary human yes, Hopkinson problematizes the notion of consent by calling attention to the ethics of right relations in connection with children, the disabled, the planetary, and the silenced. Her novels, or at least, and also those who can't easily be understood. Her novel claims its erotic strength from sorrow and defiance, or the planetary cry of no in the face of hegemonic forces. Calamity herself does not represent an ideal maternal figure, but rather a site of transformation, who comes to understand the notion of erotic maternal love through encounters with the cosmos. Symbolically, the moon, associated with fertility and disaster, embodies a celestial double for Calamity's earthly transformation. The title of the novel alludes to the colloquial expression, the old moon lying in the new moon's arms, which describes the effect created by the reflection of earthlight onto the surface of the moon, which has the effect, which results in illuminating the moon, but allowing us to see the visible crescent of the new moon against the darkened old moon as it's waning. This reference to the new moon's arms is sometimes seen as a portent of disaster, and therefore it's a fitting reference for Calamity, who lives in places that speak to wounding, such as blessé, the French word for being wounded, or dolores, the word for sorrow in Spanish. And indeed, the name of Dolores, referring to Our Lady of Sorrows, who is so called because of the seven sorrows associated with the sufferings of Christ, is invoked and embodied in the text. And we see this, and I'm going to just jump forward because I'm going to run on too long. We see this later on when Calamity encounters the sea mother of Agwe/Chichi, and she wails when she discovers that her child's, these little scales on the child's inner legs, which allow it to swim properly, have been removed. And so, in a very nuanced way, Hopkinson replays the image of the erotic, maternal, Marian figure within a queer Caribbean context. destabilizing knowledge about identity, and also challenging Calamity to rethink her own role as a maternal figure. Thus, I would argue that Hopkinson definitely evokes images of the sacrificial, sacred ecologies of the planet. There's a much wider critique of global capitalism, which I can't go into. And she looks at how bodies are sacrificed through the ongoing, quote-unquote, sins of humanity. While she offers no hope of resurrection, as we would get from a kind of Catholic reading or a voodoo reading of resurrection, she suggests instead the need to transform sorrows into oppositional agency for a planetary community of non-human human life to emerge through this mobilization of grief. In the end, then, the novel does not offer the hope of, it does offer the hope of local resistance, if not resurrection. In the face of imminent ecological and local economic disasters, it chronicles the emergence of an activist opposition movement which slowly gathers force, the formation of bonds among peoples as well as across species and through planetary being, elicits a world of erotic ecological relations which runs counter to tourist fantasies, to the pornotropical instrumental imaginary, and in Lord's sense, the pornographic. And it invokes instead relations of linkage and empathy. In many respects, it is tempting to read Hopkinson's story of a maroon sea child as embodying a form of planetary humanism, such as described by Rosie Bradotti when she draws on the work of Paul Gilroy and Vedana Shiva, to affirm that life can be reconstituted through the post-anthropological, post-racial imaginary to discover new ecologies of belonging, forming in hybrid fashion out of, quote, the unknown possibilities for bonding and community building, unquote. But to use the word humanism is to return to a way of thinking that does not sit comfortably for either Glave or Hopkinson, whose power of the erotic is intimately bound up with ecological life and planetary belonging.